All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're diving into a really provocative framework that comes from a series of analytical documents. It's called the Brood Sign-Off, and it basically re-examines modern tragedies by asking a question that is, well, deeply unsettling. And this is it. This is the question that everything we're about to discuss hinges on. It forces you to challenge the whole idea of accidents on a massive scale. It asks us to consider a pretty disturbing alternative. What if some of these catastrophic events are actually deliberately facilitated to push a hidden agenda? That's the core claim we're going to explore. So, what exactly is the Brood Sign-Off? Well, according to these documents, it's an alleged kind of covert agreement between some of society's most powerful players. We're talking high finance, big tech, intelligence agencies, you name it. And the goal, the framework claims, isn't just to create chaos. It's to use the aftermath of a manufactured tragedy to force through radical system-wide changes. To build this case, the source material does a deep forensic dive on a primary case study, the absolutely devastating 2023 wildfires in Maui. It uses this event as a kind of blueprint to show how the Brood sign-off framework might actually operate in the real world. First, let's just get the official numbers on the table. The scale of the Lahaina disaster was immense. 102 confirmed deaths, over 2,000 structures just gone. But the source documents point to a forensic metric that they say is way more telling, a 367% peak in weekly excess mortality. Let that sink in. That means deaths were nearly 4 times higher than the historical average for that week. It suggests the true human cost was far, far greater than what the initial reports captured. The analysis then points to what it calls a triple tap of systemic failures. And the key argument here is that these weren't just a string of bad luck. The source suggests that the failure of the sirens, the water system, and the evacuation routes was a coordinated collapse of critical safeguards, almost as if it was calibrated to maximize the shock and chaos. And this slide just breaks down that terrifying chain reaction. The sirens, which are the largest outdoor system in the entire world, they were dead silent. Then, as the fire is just raging, the water supply loses pressure, which means firefighters are basically helpless. And then the knockout blow. Evacuation routes were blocked, trapping people. According to this analysis, each failure just slammed into the next, compounding everything into a total catastrophe. So why? What could possibly be the motive? The source material offers this really stark conclusion. It alleges these failures weren't accidental, but were allowed to happen to create a pretext, an excuse, for a massive land grab, and to roll out a smart city model, which the document frames as a testbed for a global surveillance society. And of course, you have to follow the money, right? In the second part of this framework, the source does exactly that. It examines the financial aftermath and presents it as key evidence of this explicit collaboration it's calling the Brood sign-off. So right after the fires, the financial picture for Hawaiian Electric looked absolutely catastrophic. They were facing massive liability claims, and the company reported a staggering net loss of $1.4 billion. I mean, on paper, that looks like a company on the brink of collapse. But then you see this, a remarkable, almost unbelievable reversal. The very next year, the company isn't just surviving, it's reporting a net income of over $123 million. The source calls this a dramatic turnaround and claims it was only possible because of friendly legislation and some strategic restructuring that basically shielded the company from the worst of the financial fallout. So who's propping up this financial architecture? According to this framework, you look to the biggest players out there: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. The source claims these guys aren't just passive shareholders. It argues they are actively driving investment toward net zero and smart city projects. You know, the exact kind of massive redevelopment that a tragedy like the one in Lahaina suddenly makes possible. Now we get to a really sensitive and frankly disturbing part of this framework. It's the source's argument that children are strategically used in the story that gets told after these events, that they become powerful catalysts for policy changes. The concept they introduce here is something called the moral anchor. The analysis argues that the genuine, heartbreaking suffering of children is leveraged to create an emotional consensus. It's a consensus that makes all the political and financial actions that follow seem not just necessary, but morally urgent. And in the process, it can shut down any deeper, more critical questions about who was actually responsible. And the psychological toll on the children in that community was just immense. The source cites data showing over half of Maui's youth reported depression symptoms, with huge rates of PTSD. The framework argues that this widespread trauma isn't just a tragic consequence, it actually becomes the justification for state-led recovery programs that, according to the source, often bring kids into new data collection and surveillance systems, all under the banner of keeping them safe. And right here, the source claims is the crucial narrative flip. The very institutions that you could argue should be the defendants, the ones potentially responsible for all the failures, they get to completely recast themselves. By leading the charge to help the children, they allegedly transform their public image from a party that's liable to an essential provider, weaving themselves right into the fabric of the recovery itself. But the analysis doesn't stop with Maui. It zooms out to argue that what happened there isn't some isolated incident, but that it's part of a much larger, recurring pattern of disaster capitalism and control. This next slide shows how the source tries to create what it calls engineered linkages between events that seem totally unrelated. It draws a line from the operative narrative of 9/11, which it claims was used to justify mass surveillance, to the innocent children of Maui, used for a land grab. It even projects forward, predicting a 2026 event involving martyred schoolgirls to trigger a leadership change. It's a very provocative claim, framing all these tragedies as just different plays from the same master playbook. So, given this incredibly bleak analysis, the documents don't just stop at diagnosing the problem. They actually propose a counter-framework, a method for everyday people, for journalists, for researchers, to analyze and expose these alleged narratives of control. The source calls this proposed tool Gideon's Beacon, and it's presented as more than just a theory. It's an active analytical model. Its stated purpose is pretty straightforward: to fight back against the deliberate manipulation of public narratives that, according to the source, will always follow these kinds of engineered tragedies. And this toolkit is fascinating. It's got these modules like the blacklight to help you find hidden patterns, and a silence amplifier, which focuses on what isn't being said. There's a language decoder for cutting through all the corporate and government jargon, and an incentive mapper to follow the money and power. And holding it all together is the human anchor, which is all about making sure the actual victims and their stories never get lost in the noise. Here's a more detailed look at the modules. You can see how each one is designed to target a specific method of alleged narrative control. For instance, the uniformity detector would flag when all of a sudden different news outlets start using the exact same strange talking points. Or the timeline stabilizer, which tracks how the official story seems to change from one week to the next. It's presented as a complete toolkit for taking apart a narrative. We'll end with this final, really powerful quote from the source's conclusion. It argues that the mechanisms of control aren't really hidden anymore, but are right out in the open, codified in things like digital twins, these virtual models of our cities and systems, and in the massive global settlements that shape our world. The framework we've looked at today, the Brood Sign-Off, presents a very dark, very methodical interpretation of modern tragedy. And it leaves us with a critical question. What does it mean if the architecture of disaster is in fact laid bare for all to see?